going to do anything dangerous, don't.
Welcome to the next semantric session on divination. So a few weeks ago, I realized that one potential problem with the word psychedelic, which means mind manifesting, is that it ties us in a little too tightly with the Western psychology context in which it was birthed. So inescapably, we think about what is going on in our mind during the trip, especially if we're being encouraged to go inward or on a healing journey. So it's egoic priming that kind of ultimately precludes an ecodelic communion with nature or a collective ceremonial experience. And this becomes much more possible in cultures with less of an emphasis on the individual or that don't have an equivalent word. But another problem that I realized in relation to this session specifically is the implication that the mind manifests while I'm busy congratulating myself on its production of fractals. But does it go again when they go? There's something in the idea that the psychological processes entailed by the trip end when the traces peter out that feels directly conducive to spiritual bypassing. It's a mentality which could welcome a solid acid trip every few months to clean away the cobwebs, but then get back on again with life as it was. And this is why integration and activities done with intention are so important for bringing the changes that psychedelics can potentiate into our lives so that we're living differently. As Dr. Sabina Wantoch said in their talk at Breaking Convention in 2019 on psychedelics as potential prophylactics against the miseries of effective capitalism, they can precipitate change because you have to update your schemas beyond what you already know. But this change only alchemizes into transformation through a personal form of alchemy on which Philip Horvath provides technical coaching as a result of activity. Right by hand, he advises in his guide to creating the future with purpose. And I'll put all of these resources in the follow-up email altogether. And it's not just because birthing successive laptops gets expensive, but because it gives you a direct connection to what's actually going on in the moment. Writing and speaking are also a kind of alchemy in their own right, in the sense that the words go from being fired neurons in your mind to sound waves or symbols on a page. And this itself is an instance of transformation. As above, so below is a phrase popularized by Russian mystic Helena Blavatsky and other occultists, believed to originate from the Emerald Tablet, which contained guidance on alchemy. In psychoanalytic or personal transformation discourse, alchemy is a process of tempering and ever refining the quality of one's psychic innards until we achieve wholeness. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate, was Carl Jung's commentary on the painful learning curve that this process can be. And in a panel called Enchantment and Enlightenment given last December, Adam Malone describes the psychoanalyzation of ancient cosmologies, a post-Enlightenment phenomena whereby the ancient frameworks for reading the world around us were uprooted from their previously quite prominent position in our external reality by the burgeoning field of psychoanalysis and buried inside our heads, kind of sublimed into the collective consciousness. So we have shut the outside in. The ancient cosmologies that had once been a guidance on which humanity could rely in the processing of external events has since become submerged artifacts for which we have to go inwards and dig really deep. But increased interest in the occult has great potential to disrupt some of humanity's more destructive tendencies. But this is, in general, by its nature, a secretive pursuit studded with sigils hidden in plain sight and mysteries in its shadows. The solitary yet collective nature of occult practices is studied with paradox, as historian Erica Lagalas pointed out, ironically at the Occulture Conference, as practicing any school of magic leads to fluency, which inevitably leads to seeking one another out with hashtags, etc., and then to the formulation of exclusive sects that grow large enough to hothouse discord. Both Sabina, an academic, and Philip, who coaches professional individuals and organizations, work their magic in spheres where it will not necessarily be acknowledged as such, or understood or welcomed as magic. Much like the prohibited stimulant drugs that power the financial industry and many others, the effects of magic can all too often be desired and required in contexts that deny or look away from the praxis that produced them. Julian Vayne, however, operates entirely in plain sight, with recent roles including the magician in residence at the Museum of Witchcraft and Wizardry in Bodcastle. The interplay between the internal and external in the subject is the subject of Sabina's PhD in relation to how madness is conceptualized by society and identified ways that societal attitudes to madness can feed into how someone experiences it. It's a really interesting topic to consider in relation to magic, both because of how responding to the egregore of academia interplays with their personal practice, but also because psychiatry is a field in which so many of the elements, psychic premonitions, intense pattern recognition, that make for a good magician are exactly the same diagnostic criteria for conditions like obsessive compulsive disorder and schizophrenia. In a talk on the screening for an Imperial College psilocybin trial given at the last Breaking Convention, which is Europe's largest psychedelic conference and happening again in Exeter in April, just after Bicycle Day next year, it was explained that the exclusion criteria ruled out overt esoterica. Anyone who's ever heard a voice or had some delusional belief that might seem quite strange to us and they didn't really realize, we can't include them in our study. I went from thinking that nearly everything I say seems quite strange to realizing the irony that that's probably most people who run Breaking Convention itself, who at the very least have paranormal experiences or are Discordian and register every time there's the number 23. So magical thinking is the belief that events or behavior of others can be influenced by one's thoughts, wishes, or rituals. It's typical of children up to the ages of 4 or 5, after which reality thinking pretends to predominate, says the American Psychological Association. Classic US and UK children's book texts, including The Phantom of Tollbooth and The Wizard of Oz and the Narnia series, collectively establish the idea that magic takes place within a contained zone which is temporally and physically annexed from the reality preset, even though in the spirit of as above, so below, there is a strong correspondence between the themes and the symbology in both realms in these texts. Though the books are full of magic that endures in the imagination beyond its pages, the parameters that it sets up are an inclusion to an initiation into the kind of hyper-realist mentality that dolefully remarks, back to reality when a festival's over, there's always one. Yet, now that your ticket's expired and there's no more spontaneity or transformation or smiling at other humans until next summer, a very good means of creating energetic bridges across different planes of life to preclude this mentality is Julian Vayne's Getting Higher, a manual of psychedelic ceremony, which draws on his pagan, Masonic, and chaos magic practices and a vast array of cosmologies to offer up techniques for weaving threads of magic between timescapes that become instinctive and percolate into your practice as you read them. Becoming conscious of the many alternate ways of reading and coding the world around us and ourselves that magic theory and practice can offer is a really excellent protection against immersion in conceptual realities we haven't chosen, through provision of the means to maneuver and for noticing promptly when we find ourselves there. And now I would love to open up to you all with a question for everyone to answer, a couple of questions for everyone to answer, and then some individual personal ones, one each, and then we'll go into the wider discussion. So one for all of the panelists, it's so great to have you here. What kind of place or meaning does physical writing or the act of writing have in your practice?
I think it's super important. I mean, I type all day long and I grew up with keyboards, but there's a different neurological thing that seems to be happening when you write by hand. I think it's more direct. It's a little bit like eating food with utensils and eating food with your hands. You know, when you take a nice curry and you put it in your mouth and you have that direct visual experience, it's a little different from, you know, eating a Snickers with knife and fork. You know, and so I think it's a little bit like typing and writing in that sense. So yeah, I think I use it, you know, always still go back to a manual these days.
I love that, eating Snickers with a knife and fork.
Same for me. Like, I find writing by hand activates something completely different from typing, and sometimes I find writing by hand kind of transforms the words from just like functional ways of referring to something into like something else. So it's more like symbols, like when I'm writing in my own journal, sometimes if there's words that like stand out, I'll kind of write them in different ways and different forms, and like it feels more like I'm engaging with something. I'm not just using language as this kind of functional thing that maybe other ways of writing could be.
Oh, it totally does. I think I have that quite strongly with the feel of different letters, make it like the feel of different letters when you make them out being different shapes, and how some are really satisfying and some kind of like bleed into the emotions of the moment more than others. That's definitely something you don't get when it's all squares.
I think that's an interesting point about the shape of the letters. Like I'm always kind of fascinated by the Buber and Kiki effect. The way that we identify these shapes, and people typically ascribe the particular names to these shapes even if they don't know them. And of course if you know that effect, there's a Wikipedia entry for people who don't know this, Buber and Kiki. Even the letter forms that we have in English reflect those same ideas. So like, the S form, the O form, and the act of like making that shape with your hand, I think, yeah, definitely brings you into another relationship with it. I mean, within lots of magical practice, there is lots of drawing shapes in the air, which is in a sense a species of writing. We draw pentagrams, we draw sigils, we draw all these kinds of things, and a lot of the artwork that I've been experimenting with the last few years involves a lot of kind of asemic writing, where I'm not interested in what it means. I'm interested in aspects like the flow of the thing. I'm interested in having a swirl of intentions or ideas in my mind and then expressing them through something that is writing like. And I think that one of the things that part of the reason I do that is because I've experienced within the psychedelic state a number of times, as I'm sure many people here have, encounters with writing, encounters with I don't know, what you look at the rocks on I remember one time by the side of the ocean, looking up at these rocks, just coming out of the DMT trance, and all the mosses and the lichens and everything were like these kind of shifting scripts, these shifting forms of writing. And then, of course, plenty of people talk about DMT and ayahuasca and other tryptamines in particular as kind of creating this sense that there is Terence McKenna with those kind of visual languages and those sorts of things. So I think that just the act of writing physically, with a pen or brush or whatever one happens to be doing, you're kind of, as well as the informational content of whatever it is that might be being said, there is this kind of other kinesthetic inhabited dimension. And like I say, the artwork that I do kind of explores that a bit further. But yeah, the way in which we write, and the physicality of doing that with, say, a pen, I think provides us with an opportunity to kind of, we're from a kind of esoteric perspective, we're kind of harking back to those deities of magic who are typically also deities of writing, whether that's Thoth with the hieroglyphics, or Odin with the runes, or Hermes thrice great with things like the emerald tablet. This carving, this making of marks, is a really, really powerful process. And writing down intentions, scrambling them up, turning them into monogram glyph forms like sigils, is a technique that many people find very, very accessible and very useful as a way of kind of working with intention, working with transformation. So, yeah, it's great. Writing, more of it.
I find I rediscover it sometimes where I'm like, oh, I thought this, how interesting. Wow, this is cool. Who wrote this? Oh, I guess it's my handwriting, and then my handwriting changes too in terms of, different levels of day and stimulation and all kinds of different things. So it's sometimes, a pleasant surprise even to find something. I'm like, oh yeah, I thought about this, and I think this is also the power of writing things down, and especially directly writing them down. You ban the demon, right? You put it on a page and you externalize it from your brain. So it also helps to not have to think about things when you write them down. It becomes something extra, something else, and so in this way it's easier to handle it more objectively too.
And what about the things you write down? Do you have all magic words and phrases that are kind of particularly important to your practice at the moment, or that have been in previous times? And do you find that those kind of swap out and in, or that you've had some that have been with you the whole way? And yeah, what are your kind of ones that you return to again and again?
I suppose that there are themes for most people, for certainly for myself. Like, I can look back at the last however many decades of physical writing, art production, typed writing, and so on. Yeah, and of course there are themes that one returns to kind of again and again. And I think a lot of what people do, certainly what I do, is basically you've got like you've got your shtick, you've got the thing that you do, and you kind of like elaborate on it and you explore it and you investigate, you know, in much the same way that like an artist, if you look at an artist's work, you take Richard Long, for example, you know, he's this great guy who's done all this amazing sculptural work and all these amazing prints. Basically, there are like 2 or 3 ideas in there, which over the course of a long and illustrious career, he's kind of really played with. So I think all of us have our motifs. We have the things that really kind of work for us. I mean, in the past, I've been engaged with particular kind of what in magic I guess we would call a current, a particular kind of vibe, a particular story, a particular style, whether that's Wicca or Thelema or Druidry or whatever. And of course, there are key words and key phrases that get used within those kind of those particular kind of traditions. So those are sort of repeated, but then often they'll morph into something different as your own style is sort of brought to bear on whatever this tradition or this process is. And so they kind of change in that way.
I really like the idea of them picking up and kind of evolving in their meanings over time.
Yeah, I think the same is true with me. Like my A-level art project, I chose the topic of insanity. And then I just remembered this the other day and I was like, oh my God. And then I went on to like do a whole PhD about basically like insanity and madness. And I was like, how is it that I'm like circling around like the same kind of like phenomenon? But in terms of like words, I think maybe for me it's more like symbols, that there's certain symbols that I kind of, or maybe words. Like I think the word rebirth is something that's always going on in my head.
There's something wonderfully meta about that as well, like it's always rebirthing the next time that it has relevance in meaning.
I would think ideally what's changed, you know, it's like a good book that you can go back to and read again, and then you're suddenly like, oh, this was all in that book. I never realized, you know, when you read something as a teenager and then you read it in your 20s or 30s or 50s again, and suddenly it's a very different experience for the book. You know, and I think it's a little bit like that as well with certain key themes, but you know, similar to Sabina and Julian, I find like there's some certain key themes that life keeps coming back to, and hopefully in a spiral, so it's not, you know, running around in a circle, but that they evolve too, and there's different versions of it that show up. In terms of like, you know, kind of key phrases that I use, some of it actually goes into my work and I use it as memes that I teach people, you know, even things like, if it's to be, it's up to me, or everybody's voice matters and mine does too, you know, those kind of simple things that I teach people that are easily repeatable for people, you know, and so it becomes part of their language that they adopt, you know, in their own sort of cultural operating system in companies and teams. And then my own kind of current affirmations, I typically kind of do sort of modern day sigil magic in the sense that I actually turn those into passwords. Like we don't have to, you know, remember all these long and complicated passwords. And I just usually took a statement, and similar to making a sigil out of it, I essentially just move it around and turn it into a password with a couple of special keys. And then you have a password that you remember, and hopefully at some point don't. And then you still program your subconscious with that every single time you type your password again, you know, so you can use it like that as well. You know, for me, I mean, I'm also very pragmatic in my approach to magic. You know, I mean, there's different aspects of it and different flavors of it. Mine is really mostly about the personal, radical self-transformation in order to create outcomes in the world, right? And with a very pragmatic aspect. And so I look at the world and I say, hey, look, there's all these different esoteric systems. From what I know, they all teach you various things, but they always, in the end, teach you how to manage your human operating system, right? And I use that language because that's the language of technology I grew up in, right? And it's sort of like the Leary, Wilson, you know, circuitry language, you know, that I also adopted, and it was easy for me to adopt. And I'm like, you know, look, here's your operating system, learn how to use that, right? And program it consciously, become your own neuroprogrammer. Now we have that language available to us, you know, and then there's, of course, more extraterrestrial, let's call it that, aspects of magic that I don't necessarily deal with in that context, you know what I mean? But that's a whole different story that, you know, I can't speak lots to. But other than that, why not make it public? You know, I mean, I think this is the whole interesting thing about the occult today, is that we have the opportunity to actually bring it to a larger audience and, you know, teach it in more efficient ways than we could in the past, where we had one book somewhere hidden in a closet that you had to go find, you know. Well, maybe it's, you know, the bubble that I live in, but it seems more present than ever. I mean, down to the kids reading, you know, books and the movies that are successful around magicians, and magic is coming as a theme. And I think in a way it's the appropriate time because we need more self-authoring humans. We need more people that, if you think about the royal art of alchemy, right? It was royal, it was for the king, it was for the people who are sovereign. And if we want to have a distributed planetary kind of operating system where humans are individually respected, we also need them to become more sovereign. So I think it is a sign of our times that magic is becoming more popular again, and the kids are getting more access to it and are not discovering through that some of the stuff that's behind it, which is, you know, making them more sovereign individuals. And I think it's a very good thing that that's happening.
I think it's always been thus. I think I could probably go to the 19th century, end of the 19th century, early 20th century, and I could find you all the same tropes, all the same behaviors. Yes, all right, not mediated by the internet, but mediated by the new technologies of the time. You know, there's a great book by an academic, Owen Davis, Cunning Folk, where he talks about like the existence of these what academics sometimes call service magicians, you know, the people that you go to do your have your divination or to have the curse lifted or whatever. And at the very end of the book he says, oh, and then they stopped in the 19th century, we don't really know why, a bit like sort of, you know, religion and the decline of magic. And it's because it's, unfortunately, I like Owen's work, but it's completely wrong. If you go and look at end of the 19th century, 20th century, you know, got the whole, the kind of spiritualist thing. You've got like all kinds of people with radionics boxes coming up to you to figure out, you know, to check the various bumps on your head and Curlian photography, all kinds of stuff. And I think it exists at all levels. And one of the lovely things about magic is that yes, it's potentially completely delusionary nonsense. It's also like self-empowerment and taking kind of like, you know, and carving out a space of personal power. It's also this kind of like collective project of wondering what if. It has, on some levels, of course, it will be very deterministic, you know, that which is a nice way of thinking about it. You know, you have to get a jar and you have to add these things. You know, one of those lovely Instagram reels where some person with lots of jewelry is adding things to and then holding it in front of a candle and swishing it around. Brilliant, lovely. I mean, why not? Because the other thing about this is I don't, you know, like with those practitioners, that's what they're doing right now. Cut to 30 years time, they might be doing something very different, and that might have been an important staging post on that. So I'm not gonna, you know, certainly I've got no interest in policing this domain. That's just nonsense. But I think that when you can see like what I consider to be like a little bit deeper in the layers, that's when the interesting stuff happens. So, for example, I was teaching a course at Treadwell's where we were looking at the Thoth tarot deck. And I love, you know, when I work with tarot decks, I always say, look, this is Pokémon, right? So in the 16th century, 15th, 16th century, this is a game. This is just it's a card game. It's, you know, used by the elite. And then once printing becomes really popular, it gets more and more used in the popular culture. It's a game, it's a game, it's a game. And then we hit occultism in the end of the 18th century in France, and a whole bunch of people go, you know, papers and various others, they go, well, blimey, turns out this is the secrets of the universe. And then they go and mine the information. And yeah, it is the secrets of the universe, because as above, so below, if you could interpret any aspect of the universe in its entirety, arguably you could extrapolate all the knowledge in the world. So I always say to people, look, if you're worried about what this card means, I completely understand that, but bear in mind, it's like Pokemon, right? It's like us having a conversation in 500 years' time and going, oh, Bulbasaur, what's the significance of Bulbasaur? You know, what does Charmander really mean? And it's like, no. Actually, the magical bit is the ability to be flexible enough to find interpretations of this that might be beneficial for your practice. So the example I often give is the letter X. Here's the letter X. What does it mean? It means a specific location. X marks the spot. It means an unknown quantity. It means sexuality. It means a gift or a kiss. It has all of these meanings, and the meanings are contextual and interpreted. And it's that understanding of context and the understanding of the personal project of interpretation, that's where the magic is. That's actually the bit you're interested in. What X actually means is probably of very little importance. And you know what the card that you draw from the deck means in terms of what the little white book says. Yes, that might be a handy guide, but fundamentally this is about like triggering intuitive process. That's actually what we're interested in. And yes, if you get distracted by, should I have put the salt in the jar first and then the rosemary, or was it the rosemary and then the salt, you may well miss what's actually going on. But equally, you might spend a little bit of time doing that and then go, hang on, perhaps it doesn't matter. Perhaps that's not the point. And that's where I would suggest perhaps getting somewhere. Yeah, and what we can see there as an individual practice, we can then see, like, we can see that in broad culture, we can see that in group process, we can see that at various kind of levels. So yeah, magic is popular right here, right now. It was at the end of the 19th century. It was at various points in the kind of the 1960s. And I think it becomes particularly popular when unsurprisingly, like the kind of fin de siècle period, where the assumptions we have about the world appear to be breaking down, and we are seeking mechanisms, processes that might allow us to find new forms of meaning, or new processes that might lead us to meaning. And also where we might realize that meaning is always kind of contingent, provisional, and temporary. Increasingly, we understand that in the kind of, postmodern, metamodern environments. So magic is kind of supportive as a technique, as a tactic for people who are living those lives in the times that we live in now.
I was just going to say, to add to that, we live in a time of uncertainty. Like you said, I love how you said that there's always, at times of transformation, people look for something bigger than themselves to be okay with that transformation, right? And then either it turns into a deterministic thing, or actually in the best case scenario to self-determinism. And for me, magic really is the path of self-determinism in the end, and really the proactive way of dealing with, I don't know what's happening around me.
Can I give one more brief example? So I do work for the National Health Service, and I do well-being work. And basically what I do is I teach what I consider, much like you, Philip, I teach magical stuff, but I strip out all the weird othering jargony language. And I say, oh, we're going to do this practice, which we can think of as orientation. So we'll orientate ourselves in relation to the above, the sky. And then we'll orientate ourselves in relation to the earth and the core. And we do all of that kind of stuff. And I do this, and my boss in this particular bit of the NHS knows who I am, blah blah blah. It's fine. And I've just got an email from my boss in the NHS saying, could you do something that looks like a spell for well-being, or looks like a spell for this, or looks like a... So from their perspective, they're going, well, yeah, people understand this language, and they also understand that it's, that many of the concerns and the worries that people had about, this terribly nefarious activity, for many people that's gone, or it's diminished within the culture that I inhabit, and that the clients that I'm working with inhabit. So they actively want stuff that looks like that, because people there's a general understanding about this. And when I do activities where we use the metaphor of the elements, everyone's like, oh yeah, I mean, I've watched The Last Airbender, no problem, I got this, fine.
Philip, I have a question for you. What I'm wondering is, when you started to notice the change, or the difference between change and transformation, I feel like that's very much something that's kind of intuitively felt and somatically felt and learned, and it's not necessarily something that you kind of innately know before you become aware of it. So I'm curious about when the nature of how change and transformation are different became clear to you, and when that started to become an important part of your magical practice, and what that felt like.
I think that we all begin to at some point notice that we change, that things change in life. And for me, I make that distinction between change and transformation in the sense that, change happens all the time. Transformation is one of those phase shifts, right? Where what was isn't anymore, and what will be isn't yet, maybe, and there's that liminal space in between. And then you have a new state afterwards that's fundamentally different from what you were before, right? And that happens on a personal level, it happens in systems around us. Sabina, I think to good news for the future, I think capitalism is already a failing system. It's already in free fall, or at least that last version of what we had, it's already in its last parts. And now it's interesting to see what's the new system we build, so we can exchange as individuals here and work with each other. And I think we are indeed in one of those transformation moments. And for most people, that hadn't been really clear yet. And I think, the pandemic over the last couple of years made it much more clearly for people. A friend of mine once said that it was a little bit like, going to the kitchen and turning the kitchen light off and seeing all the roaches run around. And you can't just turn the lights back off now. We've turned the lights on, we see all the stuff that's not working in our society, the systems that are in free fall right now, and we get to transform. And it's a very interesting experience, come back to that uncertainty time that we're in, because it is a bit of that liminal space, right? What isn't anymore what was isn't good enough anymore, isn't working anymore, and what will be isn't yet, right? And so on a personal level, I mean, I've had the typical experiences like divorce and job loss and, homelessness and tanking a startup and, having like, I just 1 year literally where at the beginning of the year I had a wife and a job and a house and everything was awesome. And then, job went away, money went away, wife went away, and then at the end of it, I got some eczema on my hands. And I'm like, really, dude? Really? All of this on top of this? I mean, it was one of those things. And I'm like, I just knew that my world was completely destroyed. And I got to climb out of that again. But fortunately, I got into transformational tools early on in my life. So there was a lot of transformational experiences that kind of prepared me for that, as much as you can be prepared for that. Still fucked me up for quite a while, what I mean? But at least I had a reference to think about it, which was really super helpful, and to really actually be able to step outside of myself in those situations, be like, oh, Philip, it's another transformational moment, what I mean? And be like, kind of laugh at myself a little bit more easily, what I mean? And have that distance to myself really helped, so there was that, like the psychological, like, potentially problematic version of that would be disassociation, or a modern therapy tool, disassociative anesthetics, they can get us there as well, to have that outside perspective of yourself in that transformational process. And I think that's the key, is that when you're in the experience, right, to hold on to your point of perception that is self, right? And that you don't lose yourself, whether it's a psychedelic journey or whether it's a transformational experience like a divorce or a job loss or something like that. I mean, and to really find your feet again and again in the ground, and I think this is why magicians, do honor the four corners and find this heaven above themselves and the ground below, like Julian said earlier, is so that we have a center when shit goes around us, and there's screeching demons coming at us and all these things, I mean, and as I said, that can be, in those kind of extreme situations, and it can be simply the email that you get from your boss at work at 4 p.m. on a Friday afternoon that tells you you don't have to come back on Monday, what I mean? So it's, those kind of transformational experiences that we all have and experience. I think that's why, again, magic can be such an important and helpful tool. I know it has been for me in those situations, and it's in a way the religious function of catharsis, right, of making meaning of difficult situations. I think that's where definitely magic can also come in and be supportive in those transformational experiences. And, maybe I'll leave it with the Sufis say, die before you die. And I found that the more often I practice transformation, the more purposefully I engage in killing myself often, the easier those situations have become. Right? And not to say that they don't still always screw you up. I mean, even when COVID came, that still, it was like, oh yeah, I know transformation, this is a transformational moment. And it still screwed me up like everybody else. I mean, it doesn't mean that you're immune to those situations, but it's a bit of a vaccine maybe to deal with magic, I mean, and have some transformational practice so that you're more used to when it happens.
The willingness to go back into the fire and the embrace of it and the phoenix-like strength is really, really impressive.
You are the prima materia, right? And you get to be burned and dissolved and separated and chopped up and, put together again and let it ferment for a moment, and then figure out how to distill some wisdom out of all of this, right?
I've got a last question for Julian, and then we'll open up to everyone. So you've been involved in so many different magical and esoteric traditions, and I'm curious about when you devise a practice or a ritual or something magical that you want to do for yourself, how you go about blending or choosing elements from them all, and when you know to separate them, and what places and spaces in your life resonate with particular elements of all of the traditions that you practice and have knowledge of?
I mean, it depends very much whether or not this is it's a practice or a process which involves, me or me and another person or me and a group, because it's obviously very different. If you're working with a group of people, often there's the necessity or it is advantageous often have like shared symbol sets and kind of like agreements within that kind of affinity group. This means this is what this practice represents or whatever. But in terms of my own practice, I find it gets simpler and simpler, and I find that it looks less and less like something where we have that idea of like, there's the sacred over here and then there's the secular or the mundane over here, and we know that that's hugely problematic and culturally determined and blah, 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 all these things. And I notice that most of my practice, like it weaves together more so that it's more about trying to kind of or aspiring to live a magical life, rather than I'm going to go and do magic and it's going to look like this and it's going to be a piece of druidry and it's going to, you know, whatever. So that it's more to do with orientation towards experience rather than necessarily the grasping for particular symbol sets or iconography. I did a piece of ceremonial work with some people recently, and came back home, and what I did was I had a shower and I sang while I was in the shower. So from my perspective, here I am being, you know, having the blessing of having drinkable water fall upon me, the hydrogen of which is from the Big Bang, the oxygen of which is from ancient dead stars. And I'm singing and I'm letting go of all the stuff that I've held during that ceremony, where I've had to be like, you know, the person holding the space. And so I'm letting go and I'm letting go, and I'm being, you know, the water that is poured down from the vases on the card the Star, or that is kind of migrating between the vessels in the card Temperance, and it's coming down and it's coming down, and it's like the middle pillar with its rainbow from Kether through to Malkuth, and it's letting go and it's letting go and it's letting go. And I'm just having a shower. I mean, basically, there's nothing that spectacular about it. You know, there's no special ritual. Obviously, if you're doing a practice that involves lots of other people, then typically it's necessary to have more stuff to kind of mark out the fact that this is the special shower that we're all going to have, you know, whatever, or we're going to sequentially go through the shower, and while I ding the bell, then you'll be having the magic shower, and then you'll come out and then we'll put some rose oil on you or whatever it is we're going to do, you know. But so what I find is that I guess this is probably, I mean, I'm not a musician or whatever, but I guess if you're a musician or an artist, something like this, you're influenced by all these different things. Maybe you go off and you do some, you know, you're going to create a piece of music which is, oh, this is definitely drum and bass, or that, you know, this is definitely country and western or whatever. But it all sort of feeds in together, and so that the practice that emerges, the music that emerges, the art that emerges, the magic that emerges, is something which where the symbolism is kind of perhaps universal, like that example of, you know, given the symmetry and the nature of our bodies, you know, up, down, forward, back, right, left, center, that's a thing. And whether or not we choose to bolt onto that, like Hebrew words or vowel sounds or particular kind of pieces of esoteric iconography, kind of doesn't really matter. And for me, I find increasingly in my practice, it's like up and down and forwards and backwards and left and right and center. And I've worked with all those different systems that have these different languages to talk about that. But perhaps this is to do with like the, you know, the sort of you know, the kind of vibe that chaos magic tends to have. You know, here's all the set dressing. Underneath that, what's actually going on? What are the building blocks of this? And the building blocks tend to be things that are embedded in our humanity. They are embedded in the kind of creatures that we are. Let's do special breathing. Everyone can do breathing. Yes, of course, we can all do breathing. Right, here comes our special breathing. It's going to look like this. Here's our special sounds that we're going to use. We're going to use this humming sound. And we could call it a Bija mantra, or we could call it a kind of a rune song, or whatever it happens to be. But the sound itself is the thing. So I like this idea of, I have experienced a kind of an increasing simplicity, I suppose, is a way of thinking about it. That tends to be how it is for me, at least these days. And sometimes it's nice to kind of like dip out into something that's really kind of formidably complicated and delicious, and that, you know, I spent probably far too long as a kid learning. But even doing the Kabbalistic stuff that I've done recently for Treadwells, I've deliberately done that. So you don't need to know any Hebrew. It's kind of handy if you've got vaguely an idea of what the Tree of Life looks like, but you don't really need any of that sort of stuff, because that's helpful and that's part of the tradition. And if you've got that on board, that's brilliant. But the practices themselves can be much more direct, much more immediate, and much simpler usually. Again, it's like the symbol X thing. It's like, this is about kind of interpretation. This is about relationship. This is about inhabited practice, and all of the informational layer. I mean, frankly, we've got access to the internet, you know, certainly all of us here. So if you want to look up one of these things and you want to get like what some dude has said from however many years ago, what their opinion was about what this symbolic blah, great, that's fantastic. But the underlying structure is the thing that we're actually working with, really. rather than just these these containers of meaning. It's the process of making meaning that's interesting.
Thank you all for really, really wonderful, really detailed, really beautifully wrought answers. And now we would love to open it up to anyone who wants to add any more questions, any comments. Yeah, please go ahead.
I think the medicine depends on the disease in a way. I mean, I think it depends on what you're trying to achieve. It's like the appropriate tool for the appropriate things. And I think that yes, to some extent, I think there's that resurgence of the 60s, 70s right now, and you're seeing it from the psychedelic movement to magic to Leary, etc. Even those things coming up again a little bit in chaos magic. I think it's an amazing tool, and it has its place, and you can utilize it. Just like Golden Dawn system is an amazing system that has all kinds of power in it, that has different purposes. And so I think it's different tools for different things, and it depends on what people are at. In general, I think there is a sort of waves of evolution that keep happening, and we just talked at the beginning about repeating things and how things keep coming up again, again and again. So I think there's certain themes underlying, and to Julian's comment, the underlying themes I think are recurring, and with that some of the language of the day is also occurring, and people are rediscovering it again. For me, it was already a bit of a rediscovery of like Leary and Wilson, because I'm like, why do we not know about these people? This is incredible. These are amazing psychologists, and nobody knows about them. And I was appalled, when I really first found out about them. And it's still the same thing 30 years later, or 40 years later. But people are beginning to hear more about that again. And just like that fascination with magic will drive people back to people like Leary, will drive people back to people like Crowley, will drive people back to Golden Dawn, and then back to chaos magic, and wherever their path leads them. And I think it's really an individual, in the end, a magical path is always an individual path. And we each have, there's only one right kind of magic, and that's yours, right? And within that, borrow whatever symbols, borrow whatever tools, borrow whatever you need to do, do what you will is the whole of the law in some ways, right? And make it about love. I mean, it seems really simple in that sense, and coming back to the simplicity of things. So.
Thank you very much for all of your words, by the way. As Philip was just saying, the way that people sort of like can choose different things from different currents, depending on what they're doing, what their preferences are, what their history is, what they want as their results, all of these different things. That is in itself what chaos magic is. So it's that meta approach of choosing and knowing that you can choose from things. And I think that as the world becomes increasingly aware that there is no truth out there, or that everything is true, slightly in that sort of postmodern-y kind of way, different things are true to a different degree of truth in different ways. But as people understand that a lot of the things that we think are true are in fact quite arbitrary, I think that chaos magic is the magical system that helps us make sense of the ordinary world around us, as well as being a powerful magical system. And I think in that sense, it can be incredibly useful for keeping you sane, because you can understand the way that things may not necessarily be true next week, which are now, but that can be used or appreciated in a different way, or swerved, and things that happened 10 years ago, different things can happen that then you go, oh, that's put a different spin on that, and I now see it in a very different way. And that doesn't mean that you were wrong or right in either of those two things. It's just a different way of seeing those things and a different perspective. And I think being able to surf that as a thing that you can utilize and sort of properly lean into, to use today's vocabulary, I think that's a really powerful thing. It's not necessarily happy and jolly. It doesn't necessarily make your life pleasant in any way, but it's like that thing that you were talking about as well before, at the sort of the dissolution of the self and all of that breakdown of the structures that you thought you had before, that can then give rise to a new self which comes through, which is more vibrant and more alive, hopefully, if all goes well.
I mean, in some ways, that personal narratives, right? I mean, it's in the end, none of us really knows what's going on, and we all tell ourselves a whole bunch of stories about reality, right? Since we're here in Symmetrics, right? With even words that we have learned from mommy and daddy, and hopefully maybe it's another language at some point. So we have a realization that the word is not the thing, and we get off that magical realism to begin with. But in the end, none of us knows what's really going on. And we all tell ourselves stories. And I think one of the invitations we all have is to tell ourselves good stories, right? To really own the narrative, own the narrative of what we're telling. And to some extent, that can make you completely crazy. That can also happen. And you end up in a little, padded box somewhere. But, as long as I always say, like, I don't care what God you pray to or what magic you practice. Is it making you happy, and are you adding value to the world? Right? And even because it's making you happy can also mean it's giving me some meaning in the catastrophe or shitty situation. So it's not all, happy. I lived in California for a while, but not that long, right? So it's not always happy, but at least does it give you meaning and joy in your life, and does it, inspire you to add value to the world? And as long as it's doing that, go pray to the purple spaghetti monster if you want to. It really doesn't matter, you know what I mean? So tell yourselves good stories. And as you said, chaos magic is a lot about that. So.